basically you have people giving Putin arms, right? You have this guy, and he's talking about starting a nuclear war, right? He's starting like, everyone back off while I beat up this country. No one get involved, or I'm gonna launch my nukes. You know what? Sometimes you gotta call somebody out on it. You know what? Bring your nukes. So I'm not really that concerned about your nukes because nothing else that you have seems to work. So I don't know. At what point does the world decide that enough is enough and allow this brutal dictator to destroy, savagely commit a genocide against a free and democratic peoples who didn't start any trouble? Sure, if the Ukrainians had engaged in some kind of trouble with the Russians, okay, you're defending yourself, but we're not. We're fighting. The Ukrainians are minding their own business. In 2014, Crimea happens. Putin decides to take it. Nobody in the world blinks, so he's emboldened. So a few years later, he's like, you know what? I'm just going to try to take the whole thing. If you see what's going on now, it's a protracted loss. It's embarrassing. But to the point of him rattling his saber all the time, rattle your saber, bro. I mean, you're not doing much. You're not. I mean, you're killing civilians. Like, okay, great. The leader in killing pregnant women, Vladimir Putin and the Russian Communist Army, whatever they're calling themselves. But yeah, I mean, if you're gonna rattle your sabers, it's time for America to step up. It's time for NATO to step up and smack this guy down a little bit. We've got more arms than you, and if at the end of the day we're gonna blow up the world, we're gonna blow up the world and take you with us. We're not going down. We're Americans. We're not gonna go down. I've seen so many horrible images. Grace the newspapers, grace websites, grace news outlets, whatever. And to me, no matter what had occurred, no matter what had been visually photographed and documented, it still wasn't the catalyst for any kind of noticeable action. Now, I remember there was a picture, it was either in Kharkiv or Kherson in the beginning of March, and it was a pregnant woman dead on a stretcher being carried out of the hospital, her infant dead in her belly, 8 months pregnant, she dead with a bluish glaze on her eyes. She looked like a dead fish out of water. And I thought, wow, there's nothing on this planet that is worth that outcome, a dead mother and a dead child. And I thought after that image things would step up, but no, it took quite a while. Not until we started really uncovering some of the evidence of the war and of the human rights, the genocide that's going on in Bucha, and in other places, and you realize this isn't an army, this is just a band of hooligans raping and pillaging. That it took so much suffering, that it took, basically like the Cambodian killing fields where you have in the country, where you have people in mass graves. Maybe it took that to really rattle the world into responding and reacting, so that Australia is sending their best weaponry. The Slovaks have sent stuff, the Czechs have sent stuff. The British have outfitted us. I didn't even know Canada had weapons, and Canada's sending missiles. Thank you, Canada. So it's just weird to see this kind of a large scale kind of evil happening in the world today. And again, it's not like the Ukrainians provoked it. It's not. But understand this, anyone listening or watching, this is never going to end. This is like the way that the Russians were in Afghanistan. The Afghans were never, ever going to cede their land, and they were already rubble and rock, and they would never give up. The Ukrainians will never, ever let the Russians take over. Ever. It won't happen. They can take over, but there won't be any peace. It's similar to like Northern Ireland in the UK, 15, 20 years ago, Jerry Adams, Sinn Féin, constant bombings until you release us. It's not like you're going to take over, and we're like, cool. The Russians are here, everything's great. No, you won't sleep. Ukrainians aren't people that are really looking for conflict. You just want to be left alone, but for millennia, we've not been left alone. So
that's the thing, that people don't understand, that this has been for centuries, this battle, this war, this conflict of Russians oppressing Ukrainians and Ukrainians resisting.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, like when you see the news today, when you see people en masse, refugees, 10 million now. That was my grandparents when Stalin did the same thing in the Second World War, and my mother's family literally loaded all their possessions into an ox cart and walked from Drohobych, which is in the western part of Ukraine, all the way up to the area outside of Salzburg in the Austrian countryside, where my grandparents, my mother's parents, one being a professor and the other being a teacher, they both got farm jobs, and my grandmother would trade her embroideries in uncertain times to strange people, Germans, Austrians. In a time of war, you don't know who to trust, and they had to rely on the kindness of strangers. And so many of my grandmother's embroidered pillows or whatnot were given away as bartered for a night or two in the barn. My father's family, the same thing. My father's family was from Kolomea, in Virna, actually, also in western Ukraine. And he spent his time during the war, when he was a teenager, driving people up to the ships so they could get out of the country. They met here, and every fiber of our being, that is, those children that were born in the diaspora, like myself, like my brother, like many others, we grew up and our identity was formed by the stories of our grandparents and parents having to flee their homeland for their lives. And on Saturdays you go to Ukrainian school and you learn about our history, and you learn about our traditions and our literature and our music and our contributions to the agrarian world. Our wheat is wonderful. So many things you learn about yourself when you go back. You learn Saturdays, you go to Ukrainian school and learn a lot about Ukrainian history, and every fiber of my being as a Ukrainian American was in this history. So to see this craziness repeat itself, where this slaughter of Ukrainians for no reason other than they are simply Ukrainian, to see it happening again, it's really unsettling. I spoke Ukrainian before I spoke English, though I was born here, and I'm multilingual. But the things that we learned about in school and in our communities, in our Ukrainian American communities, whether it was church groups or youth groups or political groups, we had learned about the horrors that our ancestors had endured for millennia, which most recently came under the yoke of communism, which after 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine finally got some freedom. And it's unfortunate that Putin fails to learn from history. And this experiment, this communist experiment that failed so miserably, whether it's his ego or the ghosts of the past, but he's trying to resuscitate this Soviet Union that failed
That's the Russian Empire he's trying to resuscitate, really.
He's trying to resuscitate the Russian Empire.
He's like going back beyond and just like trying to recreate the Russian Empire.
There was no Ukraine before Russia. Bullshit. There was no Russia. There was no Moscow. Moscow was a pile of dirt. Ukraine was already a historic city. Anyway.
Well, what's different this time? I think this is going to be the final battle, and I think Ukraine's going to win because now they have an army like they've never had before, and arms and the backing of the Western world, the modern world. Like they never had any of that before.
No.
And everyone is ready to fight because, like you said, living under Russian oppression is not living. It's not a choice. They're forced to do this. They have no choice.
There's a great film called Freedom or Death by filmmaker Demyan Kolodi, and it basically highlights what had happened after the Crimean invasion and how it's either our freedom or death. We'll die before we continue to live under this yoke of Russia and the ghosts of communist past. And it's interesting if you look back.
That's why I called it Freedom or Death. That's what it was.
That's what it was. And now looking back further, just a little bit before that, a decade before that, you could see that for me, I didn't realize the levels of anti-Ukrainian sentiment within the heavily Russified eastern part of Ukraine. The Donbass region, the Luhansk region, the breakaway regions that Putin has chosen to officially recognize as now part of Russia or whatnot. I was really surprised to see that, because they were so much closer to Moscow, that these Ukrainians were indoctrinated with anti-Ukrainian sentiment to the point where they were ready to conspire on their own people. It's kind of like amazing that they don't have, almost like they don't have an identity. They're Ukrainians, but they're so Russified that they don't know what to believe. And Ukraine, if you go from east to west, the western part of the country is a lot more, traditionally Ukraine, whereas the eastern part, because it was closer to Russia, you have a lot more intermingling of Russians and Ukrainians, so the language is more prevalent. You hear a lot more Russian in eastern Ukraine than you will in western Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So, at the end of the day, this is basically a battle for people to exist. That's it. Just want to be left alone. We want to have our borders, which we've had, and we want to continue to elect people who we believe will lead our country the best way. In Russia, that's not what happens. I gotta say, if there's one image that I think of that makes me happy during this whole heartbreaking situation, is this guy has failed so miserably. There was a press junket he did a few years ago where he was skating in a hockey game, and of course they let him score a goal or two, because if not, they'd be in a gulag. So he scores a goal, and on his victory lap, he didn't see the carpet on the ice, so he tripped on it and fell flat on his face. Amazing, this guy. I mean, you couldn't have failed more spectacularly in combat. Again, to go after civilians on this scale, the innocent children, innocent women, innocent priests, hitting hospitals, hitting maternity centers. What on earth are you doing? And then you got Zelensky, who's out and about, not afraid. He's got nothing left. This guy's not going anywhere. What did he say? Give me bullets. I don't need a ride. I need bullets. Meanwhile, Putin, interestingly enough, there's talk about him having all kinds of Parkinson's issues coming up and cancer. So since the invasion, he jailed his head spy master and at least 150 or more spies because he's paranoid. It's kind of what happened to Pol Pot in Cambodia. Salah Sar, who became Pol Pot, who became increasingly paranoid that everyone was around him, so he purged his own people. Poor farmers. It's always poor farmers. They get stuck in the end by these